Today is the 5th day of this April 1985 7-day retreat. Before we go on to another koan, I want to go back to the poem that was read at the end of the last talk. That talk was about Joshu seeing two hermits. I didn't comment very much at all on the poem, and a misunderstanding occurred, and since it may have occurred in other people's minds, I will quickly go over it again. The poem went something like this: his eye is like a shooting star, his spirit like lightning. He is a death dealer and a life-giving sword. That's one translation. Another one is a sword to kill, a sword to give life. And this person who had heard this poem for the first time was wondering whether what it tried to express or convey was a state of detachment in which killing is beyond judgment, beyond right or wrong. I remember while training in a Zen Buddhist center, talks were given on the precepts, that there was such interpretation given that killing can be on the relative plane and on the absolute level, on the relative level, on the absolute level. I do not remember verbatim what was said, but this is how it is remembered. On the relative level, killing is wrong. But on the absolute level, it is beyond right and wrong, because then there is no one there who is the killer, and there is no one there who is the victim, who is the killed. I don't want to go into the philosophical or whatever implications of this or explanation of it, and just point out the danger of such a position, such a way of thinking. Because it makes it possible, doesn't it, to invoke the absolute level when proceeding to make war and kill. This is what has happened in human warfare throughout the ages, that God was invoked on each side as a justifier of the war and asked to help in bringing about victory over the enemy, each side doing the same thing. And in the name of the Absolute, which in all these various religions may be called God or whatever, one is justified to take over territory of others or eliminate enemies. Such wars are often called holy wars. In this poem, killing and giving life does not refer to taking human life or animal life or plant life. And referring here to an enlightened person who has that attachment to do that in purity. I would know what that means. It refers killing, death dealing is dealing death to what? This koan which we talked about dealt so much with self-image, ego, getting hurt through blame and expanding through flattery. It is dying to that the poem is all about. The poem seems to indicate dying with the help of another, of a death dealer, a word said by a master. But the dying can only happen in oneself, by oneself dying to all self-images, as they're seen and understood to be images, and understood to be divisive and dangerous, totally unproductive of genuine, direct and affectionate, loving relationship. And it is only in dying to self-image of being this or that, dying to the need to have that constantly affirmed or established, dying to that need, dying to that image that there is a new life-giving. Not that somebody gives that life. Life flourishes when it is not thwarted through self-image. So, this poem indicates the simultaneity of the dying and the coming to life, dying to self-idea, self-enclosure, in seeing it, understanding it, and the understanding being the new life. Life of wholeness, love, compassion. And intelligent action, which is not based on self-image. The koan I would like to look at today is a brief exchange that took place in China over 1,000 years ago between a layman and a Zen teacher. And this layman asked of the teacher, Who is it that walks alone, without any companion? Who is it that walks alone, without any companion? And the response was, I will tell you after you've swallowed up all the waters of the Yellow River in one gulp. In one version, the layman comes back and says, I've already swallowed up all the waters. And then the response, then I've already told you. Who is walking alone without any companion? In hearing that, who's walking alone without any companion? Does this arouse a faint or quite acute sense of anxiety? Anxiety about what is this asking me to do? Maybe in talking about this, one should or could differentiate between loneliness and aloneness, because they're two different states of being. All of us are very familiar with a state of loneliness. I don't think there's a human being in the world who isn't. The pain of it, and often with the pain of it, the self-pity of it. Feeling of being isolated from others. Unable to relate, or feeling that one is unable to relate in a meaningful way with others, or may not even wish to relate in a meaningful way because these others that one sees seem so lonely and isolated too. A sense of inner emptiness, vacuity, which seems to be bottomless. An image of oneself as lacking, insufficient, or inadequate, comparing poorly with others who seem to be more sufficient, self-sufficient. And a tremendous yearning for companionship of a genuine nature, not of a superficial kind, which only reinforces one's feeling of being lonely and isolated. A yearning to find someone or something to fill this inner void. And if one looks and observes in great honesty, openness, and vulnerability to the pain that it may bring, if one looks and observes the way one lives, one may find that almost everything one does is an attempt to fill this void of loneliness, this pain of loneliness, to get rid of it, to fill up this aching emptiness with people, food, sex, stimulants or depressants, with activity, work, sociability, or if all of this has failed to satisfy, has failed to fulfill, then maybe with what one may call spiritual activity. Participating in religious ceremony and ritual, or adopting religious faith in a better hereafter. Very often the hereafter is a realm peopled with friends or people that have died, those who are just waiting for one to arrive, to welcome one in their circle. Good people, angels, someone with whom one will not be in conflict. I think this everyone is familiar with, if one has at all looked and observed one's daily living, or in sitting, let all the remembrances and images of how one has lived pass by the mind, thoughts and fantasies. And in sitting, one also comes in touch with this ache of loneliness, which some people express as a feeling of meaninglessness of this life, futility of it. Just strikes one suddenly. But has the getting in touch with it or seeing it for brief moments really been a being with it completely? Or does the habitual way of escaping from it through fantasy, pleasurable thoughts, or anticipating of what one is going to do in the future, mental activity or other activity, has that continued, so that the real thing that is there, that has been there for as long as one can remember, and maybe for as long as human beings have lived, this deep pain and pit of loneliness, has that really been faced without escape, without thrashing about? Many people mention how just thoughts keep flooding the mind all the time, almost despairing of this ever ending. But maybe one of the reasons for that is filling this void. One of the functions of the mind keeping, turning out memories, anticipations. Well, I don't have to list it. Everybody knows. Maybe one of the functions is to fill this huge inner gap of loneliness, so as not to feel it, because one is deathly afraid of it. Rather, hang on to any kind of a miserable thought process, and I'm not saying this judgmentally, but a lot of thought processes that people report, they do experience as being miserable. Some of them are very pleasurable. These are the two extremes. Rather hang on to an identity of being something or becoming somebody in the future than to face this void, the ache and pain of loneliness, completely, wholly, as it is there at the moment. If it presents itself, I'm not saying start digging for it, you must touch it also. If one sits quietly, it may come on its own, unless one has faced it and there's no fear of it and no trying to patch it up with self-image that one is or will become, or what one will acquire for oneself. Why is one so afraid of this loneliness? And of facing a pain that is there? And is the fear already the escape, already the running away? If there is no running away, if there's just being with it completely, then is there fear? And if there's awareness of the habits to fill the void, one sees it, and one sees the impossibility of doing it. One has tried it all one's life and it has never fulfilled. Can the habit in seeing it stop? So one is just there with something without reacting to it in any habitual way, without knowing it. Without knowing it. Because knowing it immediately sets the habitual reactions into motion. One doesn't even have to think much about it. It happens so automatically through all the brain connections. But coming upon it and refusing to know it, not labeling it, naming it, and the attention just being there in place of reaction, then what is loneliness? Has one ever done that? Is it possible? Is it humanly possible? Not immediately think of something one is looking forward to, or meeting a friend, being with a lover. Then for a moment the loneliness is replaced by fantasy. But as one knows from one's daily life, after the pleasurable experience, it returns. Or there is this wanting for more. The more sought out in order to fill the void. Somebody mentioned to me a radio blurb which says the more is never enough, is not enough. Which is true. But it's not a justification for asking for more, but it's a fact that wanting more and more of this or that, relationship, love, sex, drink, entertainment, is never enough. Because this inner void, this inner loneliness cannot be filled. Because it is connected most intimately, or its source is this sense of me, the sense of self, which is already a separation from the whole of life in thought. So is it possible in one instant of complete attention, which is complete withness, unconditional attention, not, all right, I will attend to this for a while, but it better go away. If not, what good is this attention? To be with loneliness or this feeling of inner emptiness is unconditional. It may last in time. One doesn't know. It is not, withness is not expecting an end or working toward an end. It is not being concerned with time at all. Attention is not within this whole field of time, which is thinking what will happen. Attention isn't thought, attention is being there. And feeling and touching and listening and seeing completely what's there without any opposition. No opposition. No condition placed upon whatever it is. And therefore the energy is gathering. The question was, who is it that walks alone without any companion? I mentioned at the beginning that this was asked by a layman who had a wife and 2 children. And together they traveled around selling basketware which they were making and earning a living this way. So it was not asked by a recluse who had abandoned the world, living alone in a hut someplace. What would it mean to walk alone without any companion? If companion does not refer to people separating oneself from people, leaving the world. What is aloneness which is not loneliness? And which is not isolation from one another, from the beauty of nature. What is this aloneness without a companion? In walking through the woods, up the creek, down the road, up the hill, looking at the expanse of sky, is one alone? Or is one constantly accompanied by thoughts, commentary? Or are there moments where there is no mental activity going on at all? It's just seeing and listening and being there with what is. Birds flitting in and out of the bushes. The sound of the little stream gushing over the river, gushing over the rocks. No idea of who one is, what one is. The image may come up, but can it be seen and dismissed immediately as being so irrelevant to this total scene? The answer that was given to the question, who is it that walks alone, was, can one swallow up all the rivers, all the waters of the river in one gulp? And looking at the mind, the way it's functioning from moment to moment, what are all these waters of the river? Isn't it this constant stream of consciousness in which one is floating? One's anxieties and desires and ambitions and fears and pains and pleasures constantly streaming through the mind as thought, not streaming through the mind. The mind is that. Memories or representation in thought of what is going on. of what is seen, immediately being put into words. That is all the waters of the Yellow River. Is one instant of attention, of complete attention, is that the swallowing up of all the waters, of all the oceans? And therefore, alone? Alone with everything that is actually there. Albeit changing from moment to moment. The idea of it may be frightening. But thought cannot think of aloneness, because thought is always thinking in terms of pictures, memories, images, always creating this company of the past or the future. And the idea of aloneness or ending is scary to thought, because it can't capture it, it can't captivate it can't make it its own. And when it does try to think about it, it's scared of it. But the aloneness that thought thinks about is not aloneness. One can't get to it by thinking about it. One never will. This brings one to the whole question of death and dying, which somebody brought up in a meeting. Sitting late in the dark, and the thought hitting of the futility of this life if one has to die, if death is so inevitable. And then the pain and sadness that comes with that thought, or the fear, which is probably lodged in all human minds, the fear of death, as a deep imprint. And again, in looking at it, what is this fear of dying? This fear of death? One can take the time in a retreat, a round of sitting, or either in this room or walking or sitting out there, wherever, to wonder what it is about this fear of dying. But what is the idea of death? Because the reality of death one doesn't know. One cannot know. Because death is no thought, the ending of thought, the ending of image, of me and mine. So again, thought cannot capture the reality of dying. It's impossible. And maybe that's one reason why there's such fear of dying, because we cannot make it our own. Or if we do make an image out of it, then that's scary. Either scary, or one may think of what is going to happen after death and have a fantasy about being happier then than one is now. And then the idea of death may be having a comforting effect. There's belief in an unconditionally happy afterlife. But if that faith isn't there, one realizes that too is produced by wishful thinking. Then what is dying? What is living? We've talked about it in many talks, how we live, holding on for dear life, as we say. To whatever. Either our external possessions, the people that we love or we think we love, people we find comfort in, that we depend upon, ideas that inspire us, that give us energy, a position that we may have arrived at, a position of power and prestige, holding on to that, fame if one has come upon such a thing as that. This is mostly how we live. We live in attachment, dependency. Not alone, but attached and dependent upon others and things and ideas and groups, religions. Does one see that? Intimately, accurately for oneself? Or does one just feel, why is she always talking so negatively? Not give us something inspiring to think about. It's not talking negatively, it's just pointing out how we do live. At least most of us. And with the attachment to people, ideas, things, position, fame, or our future, the idea of our future, the grandchildren we may still have. With this attachment, automatically, inevitably comes the fear of dying, of losing it all. And again, in the middle of all of that, the central core of me, the image of myself wanting to continue at all cost. Remembering it from the past as a story, a movie, serial, and projecting it into the future, and then the sadness at the thought that this story may come to an end. Just as one cries when, at the end of a novel, the person one has become so identified with dies, or in a movie. Which is a very narrow perception of the totality of life. It is, it is a narrow perception, it is an ignorance of the totality of life, a ignoring it, not seeing it, just being so locked into this little slot with its fears and hopes and wishes to continue, that in this total absorption with the slot, there's the inability to see and be the whole. Not as an image, not as a me. But as this whole life, this whole energy of life. Just yesterday, walking up a little creek, there were little pellets of snow coming down. It was quite a heavy wind. And here were these startlingly green fern peeking through an old cover of leaves, dead leaves. And such shiny velvety moss on a piece of dead tree. And looking closely at the bare branches, there are these almost bursting buds everywhere. On a tree that is completely bare. Seemingly lifeless. The old leaves are down on the ground, just forming a mat of decay. And one wonders if there can be anything new without the old dying and dying completely. Can there be any really fresh moment in this life? One fresh moment when there are still accumulations of yesterday or last moment? What somebody did to me or didn't do for me? How I should be treated or what I will become. Dying to that, not dying to that, but carrying it around, prevents the freshness of a new moment, which is open and empty, alone. What is it to walk alone without old companions? We will end here for today.